Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. So we have Bhante Suddhāso, who will be guiding us in some meditation and sharing some words about manifestations of the Buddha. So good evening so far to Ned, Meg, Kristen, Liz, and Melinda. Good to see everyone. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them into the live chat and we'll address them at the end of the talk.
So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddha and then taking the 3 refuges. So if you know the words, please join in. Otherwise, you can just listen. This will just take about a minute or 2. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dhammang saranang gacchāmi. Sanghang saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi dhammang saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi sanghang saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi dhammang saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi sanghang saranang gacchāmi. So you can go ahead and get in sitting meditation position. Taking a moment to make sure that you're seated in a stable, balanced, upright position. Allowing the body to relax while remaining upright. So if your posture is good, then you can relax all the muscles in your body, and the body will remain upright with all the flesh, muscles, skin just hanging from the bones, like clothing hanging from a mannequin. So it takes no effort to stay upright as long as your posture is good. So once you're settled into position, make sure you're not tilting your head too far forwards or too far backwards. Make sure you're not leaning to one side or the other. Bring your hands to rest gently in your lap, with your thumbs lightly touching. And take a few deep breaths. With each exhalation, relaxing body and mind. Letting any tension melt away. Making an extra effort to relax your forehead, your eyes, your cheeks, and your jaw. And allowing a slight smile to form on your lips. And then let your breath return to its natural rhythm. There's no need to control it or direct it in any way. Just let the body breathe in its own way. It doesn't matter whether the breath is long or short, whether it's deep or shallow, fast or slow. Just let the breath be what it is. And starting with a broad, open awareness of all your senses. Just taking in whatever sensations come through eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Just letting it all soak in without reacting to any of it, without picking and choosing, liking or disliking. Just letting all the sensations flow through the mind without resistance, without attachment. And at the center of this vast field of sensation, at the center, you can feel your body. Just hold the mind steady in the body, not letting the mind wander around, keeping attention firmly fixed in the body. Choosing a place in the body to center the mind, a resting place for the mind, a watchtower for the mind, where it stands vigilant, ever watchful, attentive, yet not moving. Like a guard at the door to a city, watching everyone who comes in and goes out, but the guard never leaves its post. The same way we post the mind in the body. We choose a place in the body and we place the mind there, watching every sensation that comes and goes, but never leaving its post. Stay vigilant, alert. Taking an interest in every moment. Keep the body relaxed and the mind alert. As you focus on the body, watching the sensations that come and go, recognize that the sensations are constantly changing. Each moment is different, appearing for an instant and immediately vanishing, constantly changing, arising and ceasing, insubstantial, hollow, like a lump of foam, a mirage, a flash of lightning in an empty sky. For the last few moments of meditation, focus on the constant change, the impermanence, the insubstantiality of body sensation. You can relax your posture. a little bit of stretching if you need to. If anything feels sore or tight, you can give it a little massage.
Thank you, Bhante, for the meditation, and welcome to some more friends joining in. So hello to Eleanor, Gita, Jnana, and Yen. It's good to see everyone. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Bhante, who will share some words of Dhamma.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good evening, friends. So I just had a lovely period of meditation, and now I don't actually really want to talk. So this is one of the drawbacks of having a Dhamma talk right after a meditation period. And sometimes the mind becomes so quiet and peaceful that it's hard to generate words. So I'm reminded of a famous Zen master, contemporary Zen master in Japan who died fairly recently. So my mind is not pulling up his name just this moment. But one of his famous quotes was, he said, "There's nothing to say, but you have to say something." And this was him speaking precisely about this quandary of how does one teach the Dhamma. So the Dhamma is something extremely subtle, extremely profound, extremely hard to see, hard to understand. Something which goes directly against our habits, our patterns, our usual way of thinking of the world and seeing the world. So after Shakyamuni Buddha attained awakening, one of the first thoughts he had was, this is too subtle for most people. This is too profound. It's too hard to see. Most people will not understand. Most people will not get this. But he saw that there were some people who would understand. So he taught the Dhamma, and some people understood. So even though the Dhamma, in its ultimate sense, is something that cannot be expressed in words, something which is inconceivable in that it can't be expressed with thoughts even. The Buddha says that the Dhamma is atakavachara, so outside the domain of thought. In other words, no matter how much you think about the Dhamma, you will never touch the Dhamma. You'll never contact the Dhamma. And yet, through words and thoughts, we can sometimes learn how to point the mind in the right direction, such that it can apprehend the Dhamma. It can understand the Dhamma. It can fathom the Dhamma in all its depth. So this is why the famous Zen master, whose name I forget, that's why he said, there's nothing to say. So he says there's nothing to say. And the reason he says that is because no matter what you say, it's not the true Dhamma. No matter what you think, it's not the true Dhamma. No matter how much you study and ponder, that's not the true Dhamma. So there's nothing to say. And yet, you have to say something. Because there's always a chance that by saying something, we will get a little bit closer to feeling the Dhamma, to seeing the Dhamma for ourselves, to contacting the true meaning of the Buddha's words, getting beneath the words, beneath the thoughts, and contacting the reality that those words and thoughts point to. So that said, the topic that I'm scheduled to speak about today is the three manifestations of the Buddha. And this is a relatively intellectual topic, which I think is part of why I was shying away from it, which is that after having some nice, delicious samadhi, getting into intellectualism is just about the last thing I want to do. I'd rather actually just talk about samadhi. And samadhi is one of my favorite topics. So I'm almost inclined just to throw out the topic entirely and just talk about samadhi instead. But I also, the topic of the three manifestations of the Buddha is actually a very important one. So it's one which I think I will go ahead and speak about. Advanced warning for Theravada purists, this is usually considered a Mahayana concept. But if you read between the lines, you'll realize that this is fully within the scope of Theravada doctrine as well. It's just not spoken of using exactly these words. So briefly speaking, the teaching of the three manifestations of the Buddha is that Buddhas appear in three ways. They can be experienced in three ways. And these three ways have three Sanskrit names: Nirmānakāya Buddha, Sambhogakāya Buddha, and Dharmakāya Buddha. So Nirmānakāya Buddha, the word nirmana means manifesting or appearing, and kaya means body. So Nirmānakāya Buddha is the manifestation body, the appearance body, the physical body. So Nirmānakāya Buddha is the way a Buddha appears physically in the world. So 2,500 years ago in ancient India, there was a young man who saw the dangers and drawbacks of samsara and the potential for attaining enlightenment. And he embarked on a spiritual quest. And eventually, in deep meditation, he attained full enlightenment. At which point, we started calling him the Buddha. Actually, he started calling himself Buddha. He also called himself the Fortunate One. He called himself the Tathagata, the Truth Finder. And he then went on to teach for about 45 years or so. And then his body died, as bodies do after a while. So that physical manifestation, so there was actually a flesh and blood human body with a mind, with a consciousness. And that flesh and blood human body with consciousness practiced spiritual practices, including meditation, and attained enlightenment. And that flesh and blood human body with its consciousness then is called Nirmānakāya Buddha. So it's the actual physical manifestation of a Buddha in the world. So normally when we talk about the Buddha, this is what we're talking about. When we talk about the Buddha, we're talking about the actual physical human body with consciousness, which was a vessel for the attainment of awakening. And so this is the easiest way to relate to the Buddha. The Buddha was a person. The Buddha was a human being like you and me who tried really hard to attain enlightenment and succeeded. And he still had to do all the ordinary human body things. He ate food, he drank water, he slept, he went to the toilet, he took baths, he did all the ordinary human things that you need to do with a human body. It's kind of like when you have a pet. The cat needs to be fed, it needs water, it needs a litter box. So if you want your cat to do well, you have to take care of it. So it's the same. Although the Buddha was fully enlightened and completely beyond the disturbances that an unawakened mind experiences when it encounters the things of the world, nonetheless, the Buddha still had a body to take care of. And the body was an ordinary flesh and blood human body, though there's some interesting points of debate around that, which we'll get into another time, perhaps. When directly asked if the Buddha was a human being, he actually answered no, which is one of those delightful little quandaries from the Pali Suttas. Why did the Buddha say he's not human? Interesting question. There was clearly a human body going around, and yet he said he's not a human, he's not a god, he's not an angel, he's not a demon. He said he's not anything at all except awake. He's not anything at all except Buddha, the one who is awake, the awakened one. So that's an interesting point, but we'll go into that another time. So Nirmānakāya Buddha then is something we can relate to very easily, because we're like, oh, the Buddha had flesh and blood? Well, I've got flesh and blood. The Buddha ate food? Well, I eat food. The Buddha wore robes? Well, I wear robes. The Buddha shaved his head? Well, I shave my head. So it's easy to relate to. And especially when we read the stories of the Buddha before his enlightenment, the difficulties and struggles he went through with recognizing the futility of ordinary householder life, the pointlessness of sensuality, the hollowness of wealth and fame. We can relate to that. We're like, oh yeah, I've got all that too. Yeah, I also see the pointlessness of lay life. Yeah, I've got that. I also see the futility of ordinary worldly goals. Yeah, I can relate to that. And when we read about the practices he did prior to awakening, we can also see how he made mistakes and he got confused sometimes. And sometimes he did the wrong kinds of practices at the wrong times. Sometimes he would try to meditate and his mind would be filled with defilements, obstructions and obstacles, filled with greed, hatred, and delusion. And we're like, oh, I recognize that. Yeah, I'm like that too. So relating to Nirmānakāya Buddha, so relating to the Buddha as an actual flesh and blood human being with all the failings and difficulties of a human being, and who eventually transcended and overcame that through effort, that's something that we can relate to. It's something that we can understand. But there's a danger in relating to the Buddha only as a human being, which is we can miss the transcendent aspect of the Buddha. We can miss the miraculous aspect of the Buddha. We can miss what makes the Buddha truly special in the world. So there's been a movement in the last 150 years or so, basically ever since the Europeans encountered Buddhism and started trying to understand it. There's been a movement to try to humanize the Buddha, to present the Buddha purely as an ordinary human being who attained some kind of amazing intellectual achievement. This effort to disregard the transcendent and miraculous side of the Buddha. And this is really missing something. It's missing something that is very critical and central to Buddhist practice, critical and central to understanding what a Buddha is. So this is where the other two bodies of the Buddha become necessary to understand, because it helps to illuminate the deeper side of the Buddha, that the Buddha was more than just an ordinary human being. He was more than just a flesh and blood body with a mind that figured out something really cool. So the Sambhogakāya Buddha, Sambhoga means enjoyment. So Sambhogakāya is sometimes called the bliss body or the enjoyment body of the Buddha. And Dharmakāya Buddha. So Dharma has several meanings, as most of you may already know. So Dharma can mean the teachings that lead to understanding reality. Dharma can also mean simply reality or truth, things as they are. So the Dharma of a thing is its true essence, its true reality, its true nature. So Dharma then also means the true nature of reality, the true nature of existence, the true nature of all things. So Dharmakāya Buddha then, so Dharmakāya then is the true body, the true nature of a Buddha, the true nature of all Buddhas, the nature which goes beyond the limitations of samsara, the true essence of a Buddha which cannot be defined in terms of flesh and blood. So Sambhogakāya Buddha then is referring to the state which a Buddha experiences when it's still manifesting as a consciousness, as a mind, but it's not limited by flesh and blood. So for example, when one is deep in jhana, one can get a taste of what this is like. So when your samadhi is extremely strong, to the point where all physical pain disappears, all discomfort vanishes, the body feels so light, ethereal, insubstantial. The body feels like a mirage, like something that has no substance to it, no ability to weigh you down or hold you down. The mind becomes so immersed in samadhi, so immersed in the meditation, that the body simply isn't relevant anymore. We're aware that it exists, we're aware that it's present, but it doesn't weigh us down at all. So this is the Sambhogakāya Buddha. Sambhogakāya Buddha is the Buddha fully immersed in the bliss of liberation, the bliss of samadhi, the bliss of mental purity. It's immersed in the bliss of being free of defilements. So Sambhogakāya Buddha is sometimes it's translated as the celestial Buddha, but that's also kind of missing it, because then you're missing the connection to Nirmānakāya Buddha, the physical Buddha. So the physical Buddha, the physical manifestation of the Buddha, still has that quality of being completely free of defilement, that quality of complete purity, that quality of mental stability and unification, that quality of direct knowing of reality, which is accompanied by bliss, which is accompanied by equanimity. So even as he's manifesting with a physical body in the world, the Buddha is also immersed in the bliss of liberation. And in the suttas, it also speaks about how from time to time, the Buddha would spend a period of time dropping all worldly concerns, all worldly activities, including all of his teaching duties that he would normally do. And he would just immerse his mind in the bliss of liberation. So he would just practice meditation for a period of time, just focusing on experiencing nibbana, on experiencing the bliss of awakening. So he did this right after in attaining awakening in the first place, actually. So the Buddha didn't attain enlightenment and then immediately jump off and run off to go teach. He actually spent 7 days just sitting still, experiencing the bliss of liberation. That's all. So at that time, you could refer to him as Sambhogakāya Buddha, because he wasn't at all involved with this flesh and blood body. He was simply focused on experiencing the bliss of liberation. So there's still a mind, there's still a personality, there's still an individual, so to speak, but it's simply focused on the bliss of a pure mind, the bliss of purity, the bliss of awakening. The third body of the Buddha, so Dharmakāya Buddha, the true body of the Buddha. This is the essence of Buddhahood, so the essence of awakenedness, which is not tied to any body, not tied to any particular consciousness, not tied to any particular being. So this is the essential mind of every Buddha, the essential experience of Buddhahood, which is universal to all Buddhas, which is not specific to any Buddha, which is shared by every Buddha. The simultaneous direct knowing of Nibbana and Samsara, the simultaneous direct knowing of existence and non-existence, that knowing which is not bound by anything in the world, which is not restricted or limited by any conditional phenomenon, which is not limited or restricted by anything or any event, and yet fully knows all things and all events. That which holds all things, and yet is not limited by any of them, not obstructed by any of them. So Dharmakāya Buddha, from one perspective, can be seen to be effectively synonymous with Nibbana Dhatu, effectively synonymous with the element of the unconditioned, that which holds in it all conditional phenomena and yet is not restricted by any conditional phenomenon, that which provides space for all things to manifest and yet is not limited to the manifestation of anything. So Dharmakāya Buddha then can be spoken of as the true nature of the Buddha because it's not restricted to Shakyamuni Buddha. It's not restricted to Amitabha Buddha. It's not restricted to Akshobhya Buddha. It's not restricted to any of the Buddhas of the past or any of the Buddhas of the future. But it's that universal aspect of Buddha mind, that awakenedness, that characteristic or quality of the pure mind, the awakened mind, the knowing mind, the enlightened mind, which is not caught in anything, not caught in any sankhara, not caught in any event or any activity, not engaged in any event or any activity, not manifesting as any particular thing or any particular substance. So the pure knowingness at the heart of a Buddha's mind. This is what we call Dharmakāya Buddha. And the three bodies of the Buddha can also be said to not be separate. They're simply different ways of looking at the same thing, which is an enlightened mind. It's three ways of looking at the same thing, complete awakening. Three ways of looking at the same thing, which is freedom from samsara, which is not the same as leaving samsara. It's freedom from samsara. So the Buddha, while in a flesh and blood body, is in samsara and yet is free of samsara, because samsara cannot stick to him. One of the similes the Buddha gives for an awakened being is that it's like a lotus flower. So a lotus grows in water, but it rises up out of the water. And as it blossoms above the water, all the water falls away. So the lotus blossom itself is completely dry. It's not stained or marked by the water. So it's born in this muddy pool of water, and it rises up above the surface and blossoms. But there's no stain on the lotus flower itself. It's not in any way affected by that muddy water. So in the same way, a Buddha is born in the world, practices for awakening in the world. But when it attains awakening, it is fully transcending the world. It is not stained by anything in the world. Nothing in the world can stick to the mind of a Buddha. So just as the water that the lotus grew up in does not stick to it once it emerges from the water. In the same way, although a being attains Buddhahood in the world, once Buddhahood is reached, nothing of the world can stick to it. Nothing of the world can obstruct the mind of a Buddha. So this then is the danger of relating to the Buddha only in terms of humanity, because humanity is a sankhara, humanity is a thing, humanity is an event, and that cannot describe a Buddha. This is the danger of describing the Buddha as a human being. And that's why the Buddha did not describe himself as a human being, because a human being is a sankhara. It's a thing. It's a limitation. To say I am human is a limitation. It's saying I am nothing which is non-human. I am only that which is human. I am restricted only to that which is human. But a Buddha is not restricted by anything or in any way. So it's not accurate to refer to a Buddha as a human being. So this again is when we're talking about Dharmakāya Buddha, the Buddha which cannot be defined in terms of any particular thing, which is not restricted or limited in terms of sankharas, in terms of particular events. So this is the world transcending aspect of the Buddha, lokuttara, world transcending. And this is a very important element which is not to be set aside. So this needs to be emphasized. The Buddha was not an ordinary human being. In fact, he wasn't a human being at all. There was a human being named Siddhartha Gautama, and at the age of 35, he ceased to be a human being. Can no longer be described as a human being. There was still a human body going around, but there was no human being. There was a Buddha, which is not restricted or limited to what we think of as a human being, which is not stuck in the world in the way that a human being is stuck in the world. So we still have the capacity to become Buddhas, but doing so means the willingness to let go of our own humanity. It's recognizing that identifying as humans is an obstacle on the path. So if we think, oh, the Buddha was just an ordinary human being and I'm just an ordinary human being, how great. That means that I can become an ordinary human Buddha. This is utter delusion. Utter delusion. But it can be a starting point. It can be a starting point because it helps give us that sense of connection to the Buddha. Helps give us a sense of affinity to the Buddha. Helps give us a sense that Buddhahood is something that we can reach, something that we can attain. And that's helpful. That's helpful. As I said earlier, this quote from the Zen master, there's nothing to say, yet you have to say something. So saying the Buddha was a human, that's an example of there's nothing to say. Because if you say the Buddha was a human, you're already wrong. And yet you have to say something. So saying the Buddha was an ordinary human being, for some people, that's going to help encourage them to practice. For some people, that's going to help make the Buddha seem more relatable. It's going to make Buddhahood seem more achievable. So it's not quite accurate, but you have to say something. So we say something, and we hope that it helps. But then when we get a chance to offer a more refined, precise explanation, then we do. So these are the words that I have to share with you this evening. If none of this made any sense, then don't worry about that. Just remember the Buddha was fully enlightened and you can be too. And when you are fully enlightened, then you'll understand what the heck all this Nirmānakāya, Sambhogakāya, Dharmakāya stuff is talking about. So I'll end at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So hello to some new friends joining in, and there's a couple thank yous and appreciation for sharing the teaching. And Drew, who is still full of energy apparently, asks, in sum, Bhante, would it be Buddha consciousness unabsorbed in Nibbana, Buddha consciousness absorbed in Nibbana, and then Nibbana itself?
That's an interesting way to relate to it. That's not bad, but let me think about it some more. And maybe let's have an in-person conversation one of these days on the subject. Yeah. Yeah, that feels almost right, but I think we need to flesh it out in more detail.
Mm-hmm. And Gita says, Bhante, can we then say that an arahant is also a Buddha or on the path to being a Sammasambuddha?
So this gets into one of the interesting doctrinal debates in Buddhism, which ultimately is kind of futile to debate. Because realistically, if you become an arahant, then it actually doesn't matter whether that's the end of the journey or whether you're moving on to become a Sammasambuddha afterwards. It's kind of irrelevant because at that point, you're beyond all suffering anyway. You already have world transcending wisdom anyway. You already have complete purity of heart anyway. So I don't actually see as it makes any difference at that point. So some people say, no, there is nothing beyond that. An arahant is already fully enlightened and that's the end of the story. And other people say that an arahant still has to refine a few more details so that they can reach the same level of wisdom as a Sammasambuddha. I don't care, to put it simply. Because once you become an arahant, you're completely safe either way, and you have nothing to worry about. And the mind of an arahant is also naturally filled with compassion. This is clearly stated countless places in the Pali Suttas. So if the compassionate thing to do is to develop those teaching abilities, which are characteristic of a Sammasambuddha, developing the conditions and circumstances for helping sentient beings attain awakening, again, characteristic of a Sammasambuddha, then the compassion of an arahant will naturally propel them in that direction. So, yeah, I just don't really see as it's worth getting into that debate, because whichever side of the debate you come down on, it doesn't change the fact that an arahant is a worthy being, and that the attainment of arahanthood is a worthy goal. Yeah.
Yeah. And Mark, referring to yesterday's talk, says, what's the name of the Thai monk who talked about his enlightenment in order to encourage others?
Ajahn Mahabua. Mahabua. Mahaabowa. Mahabua. And that was quite controversial, by the way. It was quite controversial that he openly spoke about his enlightenment. But there's a few details about that. One is that he didn't do so until long after he attained awakening. It was like 20 years or something, do you remember? Yeah, he was actually close to his deathbed at the time. He was really, really old. And also the rationale he gave. So at the time, he was already an incredibly famous teacher. He already had access to a massive stream of donations, which, by the way, he lived in a tiny grass hut in the middle of the forest. So even though he could live in a mansion if he wanted to, do you know what he did with all that extra money? He built hospitals. So people were constantly throwing money at him, and he just sent it all into hospital funds. He didn't use it for himself. He didn't need it. He lived in a little grass hut in the forest. You don't need $1 million when you live in a little grass hut in the forest. So he did what a good Buddhist would do, which is something compassionate. So he had no need for fame. He was already famous throughout Thailand. He had no need for money because he could have all the money he wanted, but he clearly didn't want it. He just wanted to live in his little hut in the forest. So he had no selfish motives for claiming enlightenment. There's no way you could say, oh, he's claiming enlightenment just out of self-interest. Instead, he said he did it because there were not enough people who believed it was possible to attain enlightenment. So he said, I need to help increase people's faith that enlightenment is possible, and it's possible in this life, and you can do it if you try hard enough, if you set up the right conditions and try hard enough. So I find that quite respectable. So that's the mind of compassion manifesting in the world. That's also interesting because Ajahn Mahabua, he had a reputation for being quite gruff and harsh in his teaching methods. But my own preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, who went to see Ajahn Mahabua many times, he said that Ajahn Mahabua was always extremely kind and gentle to him. So it's also worth keeping that in mind. A good teacher will use different methods depending on who they're relating to. I think this is because Ajahn Pasano is a hate type. So Ajahn Mahabua was like, okay, the rough approach is not going to work on this one. We need the gentle approach. Just as I'm a hate type, so Ajahn Pasano always used the gentle approach on me. Almost always. Okay, next question.
Bhavani says, in some countries, women face discrimination and rejection, both from
All
parents,
countries.
both from parents and parents-in-laws. How to deal with this as a Buddhist?
Well, first off, compassion for yourself. So acknowledging your own suffering and wishing for yourself to be free of that suffering. Next, compassion for all the other women in the world who are experiencing discrimination, which is pretty much all of them, by the way. So just as you wish to be free of the suffering of discrimination, so do all the other women in the world. And by extension, also compassion for all who are experiencing oppression and discrimination. Actually, when you boil it down to it, most of the world is experiencing oppression, which is pretty depressing. So that's a great wellspring for compassion. The next thing is to recognize that the discrimination that you're experiencing is unjust and unfair, and it should not be that way. And you do not need to accept it. You do not need to tolerate it. You can stand up for yourself. You should stand up for yourself. And start to see what can you do in your life in order to combat the oppression and discrimination that you're experiencing and that the other women in your life are also experiencing. What can you do? See what kind of difference you can make. Find allies, people who can help you, people who understand what you're going through. Speak openly about your experience. One of the lovely things that's happened in the last few months since the murder of George Floyd, one of the lovely things that's happened is the sheer number of Black people in this country who openly speak about the discrimination they've experienced their whole lives. Before the murder of George Floyd, a lot of Black people in this country, they still felt like it wasn't quite safe to talk about what they were going through. But something shifted in the national consciousness such that now it's more acceptable. It's more acceptable to say, no, I've been discriminated against my whole life and it's not okay. I've been the target of mistreatment and prejudice my entire life, and it's not okay. We need to do something about this. So speak up. Let your voice be heard. Yeah, and seek counsel with other women who have made progress in these areas, with other women who have come to a deep understanding of the conditions of oppression and what can be done about it. So I can only speak about these things from an outsider's perspective because I don't have a female body. I can only speak what I know from what I've learned from those who do have female bodies. So I'm not the best person to ask because I don't have that kind of firsthand experience. So seek out some woke women and ask them for help. They're more qualified than I am in this area. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante. And that was the last question. So if there's nothing else, then join us tomorrow morning and evening for Sutta study with Bhante Suddhāso, and then monk chat at night for where you'll have a couple of monks who will be open to answering any, maybe not all, questions related to or somewhat related to Buddhism. So thanks everyone for joining in, and we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
All right, everyone, and have a great night.